Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Scholastic Lutherans. Today, I am joined by Dr. Glen Thompson, Professor Emeritus of New Testament and Historical Theology at Asia Lutheran Seminary in Hong Kong. He also served as Professor of History at Wisconsin Lutheran College in Milwaukee from 2002 to 2011, and has held a variety of other distinguished positions as well. He's published several books and articles on a variety of topics, especially with respect to church history. We're really excited to have him on today. I think we're going to learn a lot, especially about Chinese Christian history. So, with that in mind, let's begin. Dr. Thompson, just tell us a bit about yourself. I gave that introduction, but you've lived it out. So, let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Jared. It's a pleasure being here. I grew up in Michigan, trained to be a Lutheran pastor, went to Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in Milwaukee, and really benefited from an old-fashioned Lutheran education that stressed the ancient languages. So did Latin, German, Greek, classical Greek, as well as Hebrew, all before seminary. And then was very interested in other languages, so did some Coptic and Syriac along the way, and my first real love was New Testament textual criticism and working with ancient manuscripts. But my first position in ministry was as a missionary in Zambia. I took my new wife there for a 6-year honeymoon, and both of our children were born in Zambia. I did increasingly over there, besides wearing all the different hats a missionary does, but more and more teaching at the Bible school and seminary in Lusaka, and felt that I needed more training. So that's when I applied to go back to school and moved to New York City, from one jungle to another, as people often said at that point. Because I was accepted at Columbia University into a program in Greek and Roman history. And at that point, my big love was Paul and his missionary journeys, and I wanted to just learn everything I could about the background for his letters and his travels as a missionary. Unfortunately, I got sidetracked at the end of this into patristics. Just the way things go when you're looking for a doctoral dissertation after your study. It turned out that my professors were doing a study and came across a 4th century letter of a bishop of Rome and wanted to cite that, and found that there were no critical editions of the earliest surviving letters of the bishops of Rome. And that sounded like it was a easy, quick topic to take and polish off. And I'm still working on it 40 years later. One volume has been produced, and a second one hopefully will come out in a few years. But that combined my interest in early Christianity and ancient manuscripts. So I was able to travel around Europe, work in the Vatican Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale and all the great repositories of medieval manuscripts. And then because of that, was just kind of steered into patristics, found out that nobody in my denomination was really studying that, and very few evangelical scholars, and that this was something that we could use some more experts on. So I ended up going in that direction for quite some time. During all of this time, I kept my finger in mission work, had a cross-cultural mission in New York City that I pastored while I was doing my seminary work, was on a synodical committee that was trying to encourage cross-cultural mission work. And through all of that, started getting invited to go to Hong Kong as a guest teacher. And that eventually turned itself into a full-time position in 2011. So after about 10 years of teaching as a history professor at Wisconsin Lutheran College, I moved for the last decade of my ministry to Hong Kong, where I really got into Chinese ministry. I'd been doing some of that for 10 years before that, part-time. But until my retirement in 2020, I helped run this small seminary in Hong Kong. And so the Lord's given me a wide variety of opportunities to serve, a wide variety of cultures, scholarly interests that are, quite varied, though tend to be sometime between the Hellenistic period and the Reformation as my main areas, and often areas that other Lutherans have not been real active in. So I think it's been a real blessing to have had this opportunity to do these things.
Yeah, that's such a great story because I think you're right that a lot of Lutherans today and the past little while have focused so much on, if they do talk about history, like, okay, you know, the book of Acts, and maybe you know, say, the period, the intertestamental period. And then a lot of the time I see these books that are, okay, well, here's Lutheran history, here's the Reformation onward. A lot of Lutherans aren't spending their time with the actual, say, patristics. With that in mind, why do you think Lutherans study or should study church history?
Well, I think Luther asked himself that question. And we know that later in his life, he became more and more interested in historical studies and did more himself. Um, when we talk as Lutherans about our history, it does too often start with Martin Luther. And he and the great fathers, Gerhard and Quenstedt, etc., would be the first to have argued against that, making them the beginning. And as you read the confessions, of course, you come across patristic citations all over the place. They felt very connected with the early church, and we do too. On the other hand, Lutherans have been a little, suspicious of church history and the fathers too, just because of some rather broad statements about, the importance of scripture alone, and how we've kind of revolted against appeals to tradition. But good Lutheran scholars, Luther included, certainly felt that studying church history was a good check on our understanding of doctrine. And while we can't, we certainly don't raise any church father to the status of inspired interpreter. If we come up with some interpretation that the early church didn't have, we better take a good close look at it to make sure we're not just seeing something through our own spectacles and not really, doing an accurate job. So church history can be a good check in that sense, but it's also just a wonderful way of showing and reviving our confidence in how God's word works through word and sacrament, and that even in the periods where it seems that the word is not working, something is happening, and it will never return empty. And again, we see that through church history, and Chinese church history is a great example of that.
Yeah, so I just finished a book that I'm going to review on the channel. I don't know if you've read it, but unfortunately, it's out of print. It's Johannes Quenstedt's The Nature and Character of Theology, and he has a wonderful portion in it. It's brief, of course. He's covering the sources of theology, and there's a statement in there I love where he talks about the use of the fathers or the patristics. He says that we don't treat them as though they are infallible authorities. They do not lead us to faith as the Holy Scriptures do, but or at least like in a sense of regeneration. But what they do give us is a very probable faith, is kind of the language he used. That if you have a variety of fathers, if you see, I mean, especially if you have like East and West just kind of united on this, that should give you pause if you want to disagree. So I really like the language you use there, but it's a check on our own understanding. Um, and at the end there, of course, you mentioned Chinese church history, and that's the focus of today's video because I, and I'm sure a majority of our viewers, are Western Christians. We live out in the United States or maybe in Europe, and we have actually a few African viewers. And someday I hope to touch on that as well. But you are a true expert on Chinese Christianity. So I want to cover that a lot today. With that in mind, can you just give us a background here? Where does Chinese Christianity come from?
Yeah, when I teach this, and I come to this as somebody who really didn't know much about Chinese history until 20 years ago. I was 50 some when I started really working in the Chinese area and got to know Chinese people. But then as I researched this more and more for my students in Hong Kong, I ended up coming up with a picture of what I call 5 waves of Christianity that have come into China. And picturing each wave as a tidal wave that's coming in, and each one has come the tide's coming in. So each one gets a little farther into China, has a little more impact. But then often they go out, and again, it seems that it's back to square one before the next wave comes. In the first one, the one that I just finished writing a book on, and that just came out of Erdman's 2 weeks ago in February, is called Jingzhou, the earliest Christian church in China. And this is the remarkable story of Syriac-speaking missionaries who went down the Silk Road from basically Iraq in the 7th century and were allowed and given imperial permission to start a church in China. And we have evidence of this church that continued for 250 years almost. And we have documentation of it, not a lot, but enough to really tell a fascinating story. And that story has not been told well in English for almost a century. So that's what I tried to do in my book that, again, has just come out of Erdman's. About the missionaries arrived in 635. We have the exact date, the names of some of them. And then a big stele was erected in 781 by the church, kind of commemorating the first almost 150 years. And that tells us quite a bit as well. But then we know that about a generation later, 845, a Chinese emperor came along who outlawed Christianity. But kind of Christianity got caught in the crossfire, as so often happens, most recently in the Middle East, where Christians, throughout the Middle East have been just decimated by the fighting, usually either between the Jews and the Arabs, or between Sunnis and Shiites, all the different groups there, and the Christians in the area just have gotten caught right in the middle. The same thing happened in China. So in 845, the government really was after trying to get rid of the Buddhists who had come in and become too strong, too much land off the tax rolls, too many people declaring themselves priests. So they outlawed all the foreign religions, and Christianity just got caught in the crossfire. But almost a generation or two later, almost at the same time, new missionaries were continuing to come down the Silk Road and starting to convert Turkic tribes in northwestern China and Inner Mongolia and Central Asia. And these started a second wave of Christianity that took place from about 900 or so up to about 1400 during the Song and Yuan dynasties. That first wave was during the famous Tang dynasty in China, but this one was during the Song and Yuan dynasties. And again, when Marco Polo went to China during this period, he found Christian congregations almost everywhere he went in China. And they were, for the most part, these congregations of result of Syriac-speaking missionaries. But that wave also ended with the fall of the Yuan dynasty around 1400. And the third wave then was Jesuit missionaries coming in during the Counter-Reformation. The most famous of those being Matteo Ricci, very famous man who got as far as Beijing. And for a couple hundred years, the Jesuits have made some significant progress. And congregations sprang up across China. Then again, because of internal difficulties within Catholicism, this wave came to an end. The Jesuits were being attacked by Franciscans and Dominicans who said that they were being syncretistic in their approach to things. And a lot of it, I think, was just envy because the Jesuits were successful and the others were not. But they ended up convincing the Pope at one point to outlaw the Jesuits totally. And then the imperial government in China outlawed them and all Catholics as well. So by 1800, or really 1725 or so, that third wave again seemed to die out, but this time a lot of Catholics were left behind who continued to worship, became indigenous congregations, and they waited until the fourth wave came along, which was the great missionary wave of the 19th century. Here for the first time we have Protestant missionaries coming in. Robert Morrison, the first, famous as the first, often called the first Protestant missionary. Many Lutheran missionaries came in, Karl Gutzlaff and others from Europe initially. Hudson Taylor becomes the big name, starts the China Inland Mission. And by the end of the 1800s, the West has forced China open through a series of unequal treaties, and missionaries have come in by the hundreds as a result. But they are associated somewhat with colonialism and the Western powers, and this will come back to bite the church, if you will, over the next decades as well. But that continues right up until the middle of the 20th century. Unfortunately, the first half of the 20th century is total chaos in China. The fall of the last dynasties taking place at the beginning of the century, followed by warlords, famine, Japanese invasion, World War II. All of that causes total chaos. Thousands of missionaries continue to function during this period. One of the more famous ones is Eric Liddell of Chariots of Fire fame, who ends up dying in a concentration camp, internment camp that the Japanese had put him in together with some of his Christians. But the church spreads rapidly, both Catholic and Christian, during this period. And then in 1949, the communists take control of the country after World War II. The nationalists have to flee to Taiwan. And as part of their program, the communists tried to control or wipe out the church at various periods. All Western missionaries have to leave. So this is where I end the fourth wave. But at that time, enough Christians, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Christians already exist in China. They go on the continuing to evangelize, spreading the gospel. Despite not having much in the way of training institutions, somehow self-taught people rise up to become pastors and carry on. And the church just continues to flourish. And when China starts opening up to the West in the late 1990s, we don't know what we're going to find as far as the remnants of this church. And we find that it's flourishing. And today it's estimated maybe as many as 100 million Christians in China, which seems like a phenomenal number until you remember there's 1.4 billion Chinese. So it's still 10% or less, but a significant number. And they have continued to spread the gospel, to evangelize among themselves. And the biggest weakness is the inability to really train pastors and leaders as thoroughly as we might like because of the restrictions placed on it by the government. And about 1/3 of those Christians, I would say, are in recognized legal churches. There's a legal Protestant church called the Three Self Patriotic Movement. There's a legal Catholic church called the Catholic Patriotic Association. And those function legally under government supervision. And then about 2/3 of the Christians are in what we call underground or house churches that are not recognized legally by the government, but continue to function in various ways beneath the radar, if you will, and continue to spread the gospel. So that's the story of Chinese Christianity in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really interesting to see how it's not just, okay, you have this one, I guess you could say, spread of the gospel early on, and churches just naturally develop from there. You have these different waves of missionaries come with different beliefs. I mean, you have the Church of the East a few times, and then eventually, I mean, you have the Roman Catholics, specifically Jesuits, and Protestants come along. It's just fascinating to see how things, change in that way, and how I'm sure their theology has developed. I'm sure it's very different than what we have out here overall. And so, with that in mind, can you tell us a bit about what does Chinese Christian theology look like? I mean, what are some of the challenges that they face with it, and what are some of the things you think we can learn from them?
Yeah, the Chinese experience today, I'd say if there's anything that one could call a typical Chinese Christian, and I don't know that those exist, but the biggest influences on theology have been what I would call kind of a generic Arminian theology, and with a healthy or unhealthy dose of Pentecostalism thrown in. The Presbyterians were very big in mission work in the late 1800s, first part of the 19th century, and they have come back and continued to play a big role through Korean missionaries that have come in the last 50 years or so, and been quite fearless in bringing that back, though they bring in often a more reformed view, a little less Arminian and more reformed theology from a technical point of view. So whether you're talking Taiwan or Hong Kong or in the mainland, in general, I think you have this kind of fairly conservative, evangelical, Arminian / Pentecostal Christian theology that's been shaped very much by persecution. The martyrs and the confessors who have spent years in prison at various times play a very much stronger role than they would in the West, just because of the nature of Chinese Christianity. And therefore, one's experience for a long time was much more important than one's formal training in theology, as far as being recognized as a leader in the church. And of course, that has both positive and negative sides to it at various points. The Chinese, as you know, are very education-minded, as we've experienced in the West. They're very much interested in degrees and qualifications and status, very status conscious. And so there's been a bit of a problem in the last 30 years or so of this switch from leadership that was formed on the basis of persecution and life experience to the younger generation, where people have come off to get degrees in the West from seminaries and now come back and become the the heads in seminaries and professors. So they've had to kind of navigate this in a way. And I think, Jared, you looked at the other book that I wrote on Chinese Christianity and the evangelical gospel, in where I tried to point out that the idea of what we might call liberal theology has never really been grasped in Chinese circles. They will talk about themselves as being evangelical, etc., but the concept of two types of theology, a more modernist liberal approach to scripture and a more conservative one, is not very well known among Chinese Christians. Liberalism began coming in the early 20th century with missionaries coming in who were more Darwinian and Barthian and so forth in their theology. But the chaos of the 20th century in China made it such that those arguments, if you will, never got really resolved in the Chinese church. And so we have situations where rather conservative Christian groups will send a young guy off to Union Seminary in New York City or the University of Berlin. And when they come back, kind of wondering what happened to them because they're not coming back with what they expected to be a good theological education. So those kind of issues, seminaries, have not been, not very many legal seminaries in mainland China, and therefore most congregations are led by self-taught people who had to kind of get their education as best they could over the years.
Yeah, that's fascinating to see because, I mean, we have a variety of our own issues out here in the West. And that's not something like I critique evangelicalism a lot as someone who came from it, but I think there are, issues that we as Lutherans struggle with. But I think one of the most interesting things about Chinese Christianity, that has its own certain negative aspects, and it could have its own positive conclusions, is that a lot of what I have seen, you talk about how they really have to be self-taught. They have to be self-taught, and a lot of this comes from, well, your experience is a solid basis of truth. And so it seems to me that a lot of times you'll have these like really big figures that kind of march they go to the beat of their own drum, so to speak, and a lot of people follow them. So with that in mind, who do you think are some of the most important figures in Chinese Christian history?
Well, in the early waves that we talk about, there's no big names that the two important men in the story of the first wave, Aluo Ben, who was the first missionary to arrive and is credited with some of the early translations. And then a man named Jing in his Chinese name, or Adam, his Syriac name, who actually wrote the text on the big stele and is also credited as being a translator and perhaps a bishop in the church. But let's go. I already mentioned Matteo Ricci in the Jesuit period, but in the more modern period, let me just mention three or four key people in the last century or so. My favorite one is a guy named Wang Mingdao, who was a pastor in Beijing. He grew up, but as a Christian in a Christian family, but then had another spiritual experience when he was 19 or 20 and was rebaptized through immersion. Started his own congregation in Beijing and became just a very successful pastor there. He read a lot of Martin Luther, apparently, along the way. And again, I hear him in his sermons talking in a way that only a Lutheran you would expect to be phrasing things in certain ways. And he defied the Japanese when the Japanese came in to take over the area. They asked all the churches, or told all the churches, they had to kind of get together and be under their supervision. And he just refused and somehow got away with it. And this really got his status raised in the eyes of people. He also published a journal, a theological magazine, we might say, of spiritual food that was published for many years, very popular. When the communists came in and took over, again, he defied them and said, refused to go along with them. But this time he was imprisoned and spent a good portion of the rest of his life in prison. In the appendix to my book on Chinese Christianity and the Evangelical Gospel, I have one of his articles or sermons that I think really deserved to be remembered by the younger generation of Chinese, and that's why I put the entire thing in the appendix. So I think of as the great pastor of the 20th century. Watchman Nee is somebody that we're more familiar with in the West than these other figures. He was very much influenced by the theology of the Plymouth Brethren. And during the 1930s, especially in 40s, was the founder of many, many house churches across China. And his writings, his concept of having small groups spread all over and not relying on clergy, but everybody being kind of equally leaders, worked quite well in China and became very influential. And especially after organized congregations were kind of outlawed by the communist government, his type of people picked up a lot of interest all over the place and were really very influential. So the vast majority of underground or house churches probably have some influence from him and his theology yet today. John Song, a very interesting character, was one of the young guys who was educated through high school in China by missionaries, thought to be a future leader, sent off to the US for education, got a PhD in chemistry, I think, from Ohio State, and then felt guilty because he had been sent over to study theology. So he went to Union Seminary to get his theology degree, got there right just a year or two after Bonhoeffer's time there. And I always thought it would be great to picture these two guys getting to meet each other at Union Seminary. But John Song didn't really fit in very well. And then he went down and had his own religious experience, hearing a revival preacher down at a Baptist church in Manhattan, came back and started preaching at Union Seminary, calling out his professors for their lack of faith and not committing themselves to the Lord. They ended up having him committed to a mental asylum for a year. And while he was there, he read through his Bible, I don't know how many times. And when he was finally bailed out by the Chinese embassy and put on a boat back home, he threw all of his degrees overboard and said, I'm just going to preach for the Lord, and spent the rest of his life being a revivalist preacher, traveling all around China and becoming the most famous preacher and revivalist of the 20th century. So you see just a very quirky, different variety of experiences that people have. And the last person is Bishop Ding, probably the most famous of all, just died a few years ago, but for about 40 years was the man in China, the official leader of the recognized church body, the recognized government church charity, the Amity Institute, was head of the Church Affairs Bureau, head of the seminary, the most famous seminary in Nanjing. So he was the one guy who was the head of everything within the legal church. And he also did some study at Union Seminary, has his own brand of semi-liberal theology. At times he sounds quite conservative, but other times he's somewhere out in the on the edge of universalism and some other Chinese concepts. So he is the one guy who's influenced the legal church probably more than anyone, and probably not for the better. At the same time, he probably would have defended himself by saying he just was trying to keep the church alive and, be as make things as copacetic as possible for the church under the Chinese rule. So those are some of the men that I think really bear investigation and further study.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. Again, it's just so it's so foreign to me, and a lot of us here to say, okay, well, here are your guys that, not only is it that they have a specific set of ideas that really establishes doctrines in terms of like, hey, they set up new denominations or different structures of belief, but they have like real influence in almost like a different way. I don't know how to describe it. I think because of how in the West we have so much influence from, say, Augustine and these other figures. I mean, we kind of think of them as those are the big guys from back then. We don't have as many today where it's like, here's our guy. Whereas it seems to me as though in China, at least in the 20th century, it was like, here are your big figures, and it's not like you can easily categorize them in a traditional Christian denomination, as we
Right.
like to do in the West.
Yeah, and part of that was the result of the denominations being outlawed. So up until 1949, I mean, there was literally hundreds of mission organizations doing work in China. I know there were at least 25 to 30 Lutheran groups doing mission work in various areas. And those gradually amalgamated, into larger groups running seminaries, and usually around theological or linguistic lines or regional lines. But then when 1949 came along and the communists took over, that at first they tried to just snuff the church out. When that wasn't going to work after a few years, they said, well, let's just control it then. And then they've kind of forced all of the churches to unite into this one legal church, the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, that they could oversee, and the pastors all have to go to weekly propaganda sessions where they are told, or educated to be good members of the and obedient to the communist beliefs and so forth. But out in the countryside, that isn't going to filter down to the local thing. So the names of the denominations. So if you had a Presbyterian group working in one area, and down the road 10 miles a Lutheran group working up until 1949, afterwards they all became part probably of the one legal church. But if you go out to that village down the road and go to church on Sunday, they're going to have more Lutheran type liturgy, use more traditional Lutheran type songs. Whereas you go to the Presbyterian one, they're going to retain some of that too. Both of them are going to get influenced a little bit by Watchman Nee theology when guest speakers come through town and whatnot. So but you just have no denominational influence that can carry on and give that continued training to keep people in these things. So they are going to kind of melt together more and more. And we've now had this for 75 years going on since the communists have taken over. So, those distinctives are slowly disappearing. But in the place of them, you kind of have strong leaders. And so I think the strong leader who develops his congregation, and then other congregations kind of become part of his network. So you hear a lot about house church networks, and almost always those are founded around a leader rather than around a theology, so to speak. And I think that's fairly typical of the modern church inside China, but also even in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. I think you're going to find that more true than in the West.
Yeah, and I would say so a few things to that. I would even say I think there's not as much by any means influence there, but I do think in some levels of, say, non-denominationalism and the Pentecostals out here, we do kind of see this emphasis on following a specific leader, but it's not to the level of what we see in China, where it's like you don't necessarily look at this man and simply think, oh, he's just expressing, a few ideas. A lot of the time, it's very much just this guy, so to
Mhm.
speak. I mean, they do express important ideas and develop a specific theology, but it's somewhat, I think, different. But what's really interesting that I've never told anybody this one, but I thought you might find this entertaining. When I first went to the University of Michigan, I was looking for Christian groups, and one of the groups I looked into, I almost joined, but a friend of mine who led like a Baptist group, he said like just avoid them pretty much, and I was curious why, and he actually ran through. He's like, yeah, they have some really weird stuff. They're influenced by a Chinese theologian heavily named Watchman Nee, and
Mhm.
so I don't have an extensive knowledge of it, but nonetheless, I have a tiny bit of experience of seeing a group influenced by Watchman Nee out here in the West, which I was very surprised by, actually. I was really surprised by that, especially in retrospect.
Yeah, his books were floating around Christian bookstores back in the 60s and 70s here in the U.S. during the Jesus People movement on the West Coast. That, you know, things like Calvary Chapel and others came out of that. And this kind of movement of very simple Christianity, non-denominational by choice, and just getting back to the basics, being a New Testament church. This is kind of what the brethren teach, and on the other hand, that's exactly the opposite of the personality cult, because this one is one where you don't have even a pastor in your church, but the men take turns leading the group. So it's interesting. But the Watchman Nee was having influence already back in the 60s and 70s here in the U.S., I remember.
And a final thing I'll say on that is, if I were John Sung, I would not have gone to Ohio State. If he were to throw anything overboard, going
Yeah.
back to China, I would have thrown not like the degrees of, PhD in chemistry. I would throw specifically that he got this stuff from Ohio State. That's just me as a Michigan alum. So unbiased, but
Yeah.
um, in all seriousness, though, I mean, so we talk about how Chinese Christianity is so different from ours. Or like the history of it, so to speak. We're so used to, you know, what we see in, say, the patristics, and we develop into denominations, all that. Whereas Chinese Christians, it's very different in a lot of ways. What do you think are some of the key lessons that we can learn from Chinese Christianity?
Well, one of the interesting things is, the more I study Chinese history, I noticed the less my students were interested in it. the history is not something that the modern Chinese people take very seriously, and they don't get much of it in class. But then that carried over to theology as well. In general, Chinese are very practical. And so in seminary course, you have to kind of convince them that whatever your course is really going to be practical for them in their congregation, in their ministry. Otherwise, whether it's learning Greek or studying systematics or confessions or church history, they're just not interested in it at all. So this practical side of things, I think, really is one area where the Chinese are very different. And this is, I don't know if it's something particularly linked with the Christian approach or whether it's more Chinese culture in general. I would say that the other thing is the prosperity gospel is very tempting for Chinese people. Um, Whether, again, you're in overseas Chinese or in the mainland, prosperity has always been seen as a blessing that is can often be linked anyway with Christianity in the West. And so I think this also offers a peculiar danger that one has to be aware of in Chinese culture. And go back to the rest of your question. I think I got off track a little.
Yeah, don't worry about getting off track there. We get off track here all the time. But overall, I mean, what do you think are, say, the big things that we can just learn about Chinese Christianity? That was my original question.
Yeah. Um, I think the simple faith in the scriptural text is something that the Chinese are very good at. Um, they are, as I said, that liberalism doesn't really, you know, they don't know what that is. I have to talk and really define that before it makes any sense to them. And that's a danger, as I said. But on the other hand, it's a good thing. You know, they don't need books on can we trust the Gospels or something like this. They read Scripture and they accept what Scripture says. So it's a matter of a simple childlike faith, I'd say, that I just really admire with so many of my Chinese brothers and sisters. The ones in the mainland also just have an incredible ability to function as Christians in less than ideal circumstances. And unfortunately, we can't really talk about that too much and give practical examples or anything because of the sensitivity of things. And I have to be a little careful what I say too. But all I can tell you is that they continue despite all the crackdowns that are occurring. And right now, with the new implementation of facial recognition software, um, outlawing of VPNs, and outlawing the use of Zoom and other social media for communications of religious topics in the mainland. There's just been a lot of recent crackdowns, but somehow they continue to function. They continue to be to praise the Lord and to do it with happy hearts, to continue to evangelize, and they just are fearless, if you will, in the face of a lot of adversity.
Yeah, I know of, and this is beyond secondhand. I don't know if we call this third hand, but I have a friend who knows someone who grew up in the Chinese mainland and was a very, when I say Orthodox Christian, I don't mean like Eastern Orthodox. I just mean somebody who held what we would generally hold to be traditional Christian ideas. And one of the things he said that's fascinating is that he and his friends out there, sometimes they will pray that we in the United States, that we get to experience some of the suffering they do, not out of spite, not out of vengeance, but they see some of the issues we have and they say, like, for them it's helped them a lot grow in their faith and see the working of God, and we in the West could use some of that. And I think that's a way that we could experience it. Yeah, there's just so much to learn from them, I think. And one of those, it's we often think, and this is something I'm trying to really grasp, we don't know when Christ is going to return, right? I growing up in dispensationalism, it was, he'll be here in my lifetime, right? He'll be back. I won't die. I'll be raptured. That was kind of my attitude. But as I think more, I think about how in theory, Christianity, I mean, the world could go for thousands of more years before Christ returns, and tens of thousands potentially. We just can't give a date. And so I think one of the things that if I had the chance to live that long, I would love to see how Christian history develops, because you have the missionary groups, but it seems to me like Christianity is really just starting to grow and develop with their terms, their understanding of advanced theological topics that maybe happened a bit earlier. out in the West, largely, I think, because of political factors. So there's a
Mm.
lot to learn from them that maybe we don't have now, but I think that it's going to be a really interesting development in the future.
And the Chinese are very, very mission minded. I don't know if you've heard of the Back to Jerusalem movement, but
I
for a
haven't.
while this was a big topic. It's died down a little bit, but I think it's very indicative of the Chinese mentality, where they had the image of the gospel starting in Jerusalem and spreading westward all the way around the globe back to China. But the area between China and Jerusalem is still the most unevangelized section of the world, with the subcontinent, Central Asia, the Middle East, all needing to hear the gospel. And so they said, well, this may be what the Lord is leaving open for us. This is our mission field. And so they really were thinking that while Westerners can't get into these places, Chinese people maybe can. And so maybe it's our duty to get in and to help evangelize that section of the world. And so that's just one example of the kind of mission thinking that they have, and really are challenging themselves to reach out with the gospel.
Yeah, yeah, that's a honestly a beautiful mentality. We tend, I think Lutherans are actually really good about this, but I think a lot of the time people think of, okay, well, belief, you have belief over here. We've already kind of given the information, or people have kind of heard of Christianity over there. We're, it's fine. It's fine. Whereas we Lutherans tend to look at things as every single day is a new day to relearn the gospel, to repent, all of that. The life of a Christian is a life of repentance. And putting that at a macro scale, I think we tend to think, all right, we've got the gospel's kind of everywhere at this point. All the information's out there, and we in the West are the ones that have done it. But seeing these Chinese Christians who themselves are suffering through a lot, and are still developing, I think it not in a sense of like, oh, they don't know what they're doing, but taking terms that we're so used to from, say, Latin or Greek, and especially the English translations, and getting them in Chinese. As they're still going through that, yet they have this simple faith that they're able to spread, and they have a great mission to perform. Um, so with that in mind, I just have, one final question. This is more about you. So I should just say, spoiler for everybody. I mean, we hope to have you back on at some point, because we can't, for one, we can't summarize Chinese Christian history so quickly. But also, I mean, your work spans so much phenomenal stuff, and there's a lot to learn from everything you've done. With that in mind, what are you doing nowadays? I mean, you just published a book 2 weeks ago as the time of recording. So you're still writing, and it seems to be, editing things. Just what else you got going on?
Yeah, well, since retirement in 2020 and moving back to the U.S., grandparenting, we've had a little catching up to do on that since we were overseas. And actually, COVID assisted us doing that a bit because we could make our local grandchildren into part of our bubble and spend some time with them. But I've been very blessed with my retirement of having lots of different projects. There are 2 or 3 different research areas, and the Chinese one is one that I'm, I won't say finished with, but I'm kind of handing off because it really wasn't the center of my wheelhouse as far as my gifts go and my training. So patristics, we're still doing a lot. I have a website called fourthcentury.com, and that focuses on the 4th century. And next year will be the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. So we are trying to put up on the web all of the ancient testimonies to the early Council of Nicaea and all the material connected with that. We also have a longer term project on the Council of Ephesus of 431. Maybe by 2031, we will have all the information up on that one. And with my original doctoral work, I did publish a number of years ago the correspondence of Pope Julius I from the 4th century, which, among other things, has the earliest surviving copy of the Apostles' Creed, or the Roman Baptismal Creed, edited in it. And now I'm working on the next volume of the correspondence of Pope Liberius, which is a very fascinating period in the middle of the Constantinian age of the 4th century. And then we're continuing to work on our other project of mapping Paul's Roman roads that I got into, again, 15 years ago. And a book just came out in January from Lexham Press that I co-authored with Mark Wilson, called In This Way We Came to Rome, with Paul on the Appian Way. And it guides you 153 Roman miles along the route from Puteoli to Rome that Paul took as a prisoner in Acts 28, through the 3 taverns in the Forum of Appius mentioned in Acts, and is just a guidebook to what it would have been like if you had traveled with Paul on that trip. And so we have further research that we're doing on Paul's travels in Greece and in what's now Turkey as well. So that's more than enough to keep me busy.
I've talked with my girlfriend about this one, because I'm obviously not anywhere close to retirement. Unless someone wants to give me millions of dollars, I'm unfortunately not close to retirement, but I don't think I'll ever truly just stop. I like to think that when I retire from my day job, I'll just do this kind of thing full time, just do my own research and work on my own stuff. So it's wonderful to see that you're still putting stuff out there. It's really good to hear. With that in mind, is there anything that you want to say? Just any final thoughts as we finish off this broadcast?
I would just say keep the Christians of China in your prayers. The Lord is doing wonderful things through them, but they do have their struggles, and they can always use our prayers. And we're doing our best to get some good Lutheran theology out there to join the other things that are available in Chinese. Our Asia Lutheran Seminary website has a number of the different books and materials we have, including a church history textbook and a source book of early church fathers that have never been available in Chinese before, that we're having. So there's just a number of good materials out there, and would just ask your prayers upon both the work that all the missionaries and Chinese evangelists do, as well as what the Lord's doing inside China.
Well, thanks again for coming on the show, Dr. Thompson. Again, I hope to have you back on, and I learned a lot in this, and I hope our viewers do too.
It's been a pleasure, Jared. Blessings.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching another Scholastic Lutherans video. If you'd like to support us, you can follow us on Twitter at Gerhard's Ghost, or contribute on Patreon at Scholastic Lutherans. There you'll get access to our Telegram chat and other perks. Links can be found in the description. Subscribe, like, or leave a comment, and have a nice day.